Welcome to Study Session 3. The question of methodology in African philosophy. Introduction. In this study session, we will explore different approaches to African philosophy. These approaches include traditional intellectual search approach, particularist or relevance approach, universalist or pluralist approach, language methodology, conceptual decolonization approach, and method of classification or periodization. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Explain at least 4 approaches to African philosophy. Approaches to African philosophy. There are at least 6 distinct approaches or methodologies in African philosophy. So they are: 1. The traditional intellectual search approach. 2. The particularist or relevance approach. 3. The universalist or pluralist approach. 4. The language methodology. 5. Conceptual decolonization approach. And 6. The method of classification or periodization. Let us discuss these approaches in turns. Traditional intellectual search approach. The first approach or methodology adopted by African philosophers that we shall mention here is what may be called the traditional intellectual approach. According to those who hold the view that this is the best approach to African philosophy, all we need do is to go back to the African leaders, hold discussions with them on philosophical matters, and then document such findings as African philosophy. This is because, according to Paul Redding, who is a major supporter of this view, there was, and perhaps there still in existence, an autonomous intellectual class in traditional African society. But some African philosophers, especially the modernists or professional philosophers, have rejected this view for at least 2 interrelated reasons. Philosophy is an individual task. This means that real philosophical opinions can only be expressed by one person. But the so-called traditional intellectual class in Africa merely repeats the popular community views. For this reason, such views cannot pass as real philosophy. The professional African philosophers, like Peter Bodurin, also argue that any serious philosophical work cannot be produced without writing. And since the traditional sages are not educated and do not write, they cannot possibly do philosophy. But if we look carefully at this criticism leveled against the traditional intellectual sage approach by professional African philosophers, we will see that this group may not be entirely correct. This is because A. People in traditional society hold individual and different opinions about matters that concern them. And B. It is not true that people cannot think or philosophize if they cannot write. Rather, in traditional societies, the ideas of great thinkers and philosophers are usually passed on as pithy sayings, proverbs, and folklores. Particularist or relevance approach. The professional philosophers represent the 4th trend in Odera Oruka's classification of the various trends in African philosophy. We will talk more about Oruka and his 4 trends in African philosophy in the next section. Now, within the professional fold, We can identify two different groups, and the two groups can be classified along their preferred approaches to African philosophy. They are the particularist and universalist groups. Let us first discuss the particularist group and then follow it up with the universalist. The particularists are interested in the relevance of African philosophy to contemporary African situations and problems. They see African philosophy as contemporaneous with philosophical investigations, having a special relevance to Africa. Bello further clarifies the particularist viewpoint. According to him, the particularists say that no philosophy is African philosophy unless it deals with a specific African theme, topic, or problem. For example, the Yoruba conception of the person, the Akan conception of truth, the Luo concept of God, Igbo philosophy, and so on. What the particularist or relevance group are simply saying is that African philosophy should be done in such a way that it will be of direct relevance or importance to African societies. They may be right to some extent. After all, what will be the value of any philosophy if it does not help us to consciously re-examine the ideas we live by? Again, we cannot pretend that some philosophical discussions like logic, ontologic, Greek science and religion, and so on, can be said to qualify as African philosophy. In fact, it doesn't help the development of African philosophy for us to include such discussions in African philosophy. Some members of the particularist group are Godwin Shogolo and Olusegun Oladipo, among others. Universalist or pluralist approach. The universalists or pluralists reject the viewpoint of the particularist. They argue that there are some things that are common in every philosophy, such as criticism, reconstruction, explanation, and justification. We cannot therefore formulate a special brand of philosophy and name it African philosophy. This will be as funny as formulating African mathematics, African physics, or African chemistry. Again, the universalists insist that Africa is part of the world, and being part of the world, other people's cultures, religions, and worldviews have now penetrated Africa. We now have Christianity, Islam, urbanization, industrialization, and globalization as part and parcel of African reality. Apart from this, Africans are simply human beings with the same biological makeup as other humans. So human problems are African problems, and African problems are human problems. There is no pure African or unique African situation or problem. For these reasons, the universalists finally conclude that the best approach to African philosophy is through cross-cultural and interdisciplinary comparisons. Members of this group are Peter Bodori, Odera Oruka, Pauline Otonji, Kwesi Weredu, and AGA Bello. Language, methodology, or approach. Another group of African philosophers are more concerned with the language of African writers and philosophers. This group is worried about the very fact that African philosophy is being done in English, French, and other foreign languages. They argue that because of this, African philosophy is not really African. And as a result of this too, many Africans do not really understand African philosophy, which means that in the end, African philosophy does not really serve any useful purpose to us, as it is far removed from our culture and environment. Therefore, the view of those who support the language approach is that we should make effort to domesticate foreign ideas and concepts so that they will have real meaning to us and our environment. This we can do by translating foreign concepts and ideas into own languages. Concepts like democracy, rule of law, mind and body, appearance and reality, destiny, globalization, etc. If translated into our indigenous languages, will have deeper meanings for us. Indeed, for some of those who support the language approach, Wiredu, for example, if we translate certain concepts and ideas into our own languages, some of the controversies that surround them in Western philosophy will be discovered to have nothing to do with African cultures. Conceptual decolonization as an approach to African philosophy. Closely related to the language approach is the conceptual decolonization methodology. This group, which is again led by the Ghanaian-born foremost African philosopher Kwesi Wiredu, is of the belief that African philosophy will be done better if we are conceptually decolonized. But what exactly is conceptual decolonization? Now, we all know what colonization means. Colonization refers to the condition of African countries found themselves when they were being ruled by European countries. Decolonization can take at least two ways: political and conceptual. Most African countries have achieved political decolonization or political freedom with independence. But conceptual decolonization has to do with abandoning European mentality or the view that anything European is better than those in Africa. This mental or conceptual decolonization, it is argued, must begin from thinking philosophically and writing in our own indigenous languages. According to those who support the conceptual decolonization approach, all we need do is to enrich and develop African languages for the purpose of science and technology and philosophizing itself. The method of classification or periodization. Finally, there are those who insist on a clear-cut reconstitution of African philosophy. For them, this can be done by dividing African philosophy into periods or epochs. So in this sense, we shall have ancient African philosophy, modern African philosophy, and contemporary African philosophy. According to the proponents, it is only when we understand African philosophy in this way that we shall escape some of the controversies surrounding its existence and validity. Study session summary. In this study session, we examined the 6 major approaches to African philosophy. They are the traditional intellectual sage approach, the particularist or relevance approach, the universalist or pluralist approach, the language methodology, conceptual decolonization approach, and the method of classification or periodization. End of study session 3.